So hopefully, if you miss it, you'll still be able to catch up with the lesson. So, all right, again, thanks for coming back for Epic. This is session 2. We're going to start persecution, the first part of the persecution lesson today. So it's going to be an interesting lesson, interesting time period. We can do just a quick recap of what happened last time, but for anybody that has a book, you should also have your timeline sheet here. Last time we covered the introduction and then the first time period, which is the mustard seed, which is from 33 AD to 99 AD. And so during that time, we talked about the formation of the church in its beginning, its infancy, and that began with Pentecost. And then from Pentecost, we covered St. Paul's missionary journeys. We covered the Council of Jerusalem, the burning of Rome and Nero's persecution, the destruction of Jerusalem, the Didache, which is the teachings of the 12 apostles, the early persecution by Domitian, Pope St. Clement's letters, and the death of St. John, the last apostle, in approximately 100 AD. So those were some of the events that we covered, and that was the formation of the church. Does anybody remember why it's called the mustard seed? Why he entitled it that? Anybody? Right, yeah, it's based off of the parable in the Bible where we hear about how the smallest seed grows into the largest plant. And so that was the church in its infancy. And so from the beginning, the church started out obviously very small. It started out as a small group, a sect of the Jewish population. And at first, Rome really didn't even recognize it as a separate entity. And so it grew from there. And as we move into this next time period of persecution, you're going to see Rome starts to recognize it, and not only recognize it, but oppose it quite fiercely. And so we're going to see what happens during the years of the persecution. So this next lesson that we're going to cover, persecution, is from about 100 AD until 312 AD. And this will actually be in 2 lessons, this week and next week as well. But persecution, we're going to see a lot of things happening in here that shape and form the church through the crucible, through fire, as it were. We're going to see Christians who are giving their lives for the faith, Christians who are professing their faith and losing their life, but we're also going to see a lot of gains made by the church, which almost seems contradictory. But as we go through, you'll start to understand why. You'll understand that the people that were living the faith were so firm in their beliefs that it brought people to Christianity. And so we're going to see quite a transformation in this period, which ultimately, after the end of the next lesson, will lead us into conversions and councils. So that's where we're going tonight. And before we start, let's start in a short prayer. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the opportunity to gather here tonight. We thank you for the opportunity to learn more about your church. We thank you for the opportunity to grow in our faith and our love and our service for you. Lord, help us as we continue on this journey to deepen our faith and to help us to know you more through your church. We thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for all of those who have chosen to attend, and we ask that you would enrich them greatly with your blessings as we venture towards you and grow in our faith. And so, Lord, we thank you for all of these things, and we ask this in your holy name. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So, any questions about last lesson? Any questions about the time period? Anything else like that? No? Everybody's good? So, okay. Well, we can go ahead and move into persecution, part 1. And we'll make sure our volume is up here. And we'll get rolling. And let me know if the volume is okay back there, okay?
Welcome back to Epic, a journey through church history. We're going to be talking about our second time period, the time period of persecution,
in this session. And the time period of persecution runs from the year 100 to 312 AD, right before the Edict of Milan. And we'll talk about that important document in the next time period, when the faith was actually legalized through the Roman Empire, and when the old Neronian law making it illegal to be a Christian was finally overturned by the Emperor Constantine. But in this time period of persecution, we've chosen the color dark red. It's used in reference to remind us of the blood that was spilled by the martyrs, but also in particular to remember this great quote from one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, who said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians." And we'll see this session and next session, we'll talk about the persecution of the church and all the many martyrs, and we'll see how their blood and their witness then brought about the conversion of the empire and our next time period of conversion and councils. So the main theme of this time period is persecution. It reminds us of what Christ said in the scriptures in the Gospel of John. But remember the words that I said to you, "A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you." So this time period is about the state-sponsored persecution of the Christian faith. For over 200 years, the faith was persecuted actively by the Roman Empire. Now, when I say the persecution was active, doesn't mean that there was every single day through those 200 years was there a persecution ongoing. Because sometimes persecutions were local and regionalized. Sometimes they just were in a particular city or in a particular province of the empire. Other times, the persecutions were empire-wide. Also, even during this period of time, there was periods of relative peace, where the church was, for the most part, left alone. But those times when there were persecution, it was very, very intense. So think about that. Over 200 years, the church lived in a state of persecution. That's a little, it's almost like the life of our country. The United States, the history of our country is a little over 200 years old. So just think about that. For the whole history of our country, the church was in persecution by the Roman Empire. It's just an amazing amount of time. Now, before we get into the actual discussion of the persecutions and what happened during these persecutions and some of the major saints and martyrs who were killed, we need to take a brief moment and focus on understanding what the church was during this period of time. We saw a little bit in our last time period of mustard seed what the church was and how the church was structured through the letter of Pope St. Clement. We talked about that at the end of our time period last time. That Pope St. Clement wrote that letter to the Corinthians. And in that letter, he discusses important points that make up our church. Such notions and ideas and beliefs that the clergy derive their authority from God and not from man. The understanding of apostolic succession, that Christ gave his power and authority to his apostles, and the apostles then handed that authority on to other men in a continuous line all the way up into our own day and age. And then the last major point that Clement made in that letter was he talked about he mentioned and he brought to himself the understanding of the universal primacy of the Pope, meaning that the Pope has jurisdiction throughout the entire church. He was writing about a matter of the church in Corinth, and he's the Bishop of Rome. There was a Bishop of Corinth, but he is writing and saying, "I hear what's going on in your community. It's not right. Because I'm the successor of St. Peter, I have a universal mission to teach and to govern the church. Listen to me as you would listen to the words of Christ," is what he says specifically in his letter. So we have this understanding from the very beginnings of our history of the role and the function of the papacy. So it's important to keep in mind. So the church has this role, this function, this hierarchical structure centered on the Pope, then obviously the bishops in communion with him, priests, deacons, laity throughout the church. Now the church in the Roman Empire, again, was separate from the empire. It had grown up as a separate organization, an organism within the empire. It was very disciplined and organized, as we talked about. It had a visible structure, which we mentioned. It also had exact doctrine. The church knew what it believed and taught what it believed. And it had two main central doctrines then, as it does now. The fact of the incarnation, that Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, became true God, became true man, took on human flesh, became like us in all things but sin. And then also the other major doctrine was the Eucharist. The understanding that Christ had gives us his body, blood, soul, and divinity under the appearance of bread, water, and wine in the Eucharist. The church was united during this period of time. We saw this brief revolt here in Corinth, but that was taken care of. But for the most part, the church was united and the church was growing. The church will see a great growth during the time of persecution, and we'll explain why in a moment. Now, Roman society at this time, so that was the church. Now, Roman society at this time believed that man was sufficient to himself and that all belief was a matter of opinion. That doesn't sound familiar, does it? Does that sound like our modern world? Right, man is sufficient to himself and all belief is a matter of opinion. It's what our culture is founded upon today. Roman society was exactly the same way. So the Christian faith coming into this society was obviously very countercultural. And it hits up against this culture that is very antithetical to some of the basic tenets of our faith. And that's one reason why the persecutions erupted. We'll talk about more in just a minute. Now, as the faith spread throughout the empire, we had Roman writers who heard the faith and who were obviously against the faith because they were pagan, and they began to write tracts and books against the faith. And there were four main attacks that these Roman writers levied against the church. And they attacked the church primarily so that other Romans wouldn't convert, that other citizens of the empire wouldn't convert to this faith because of these four main issues or problems that these writers saw with the faith. The first attack that they levied against the church was that all those who were Christian were ignorant and poor. Now that might not make a whole lot of sense to us as to, okay, so they're ignorant and poor. Why would that matter? Well, in Roman society, that was a huge deal. Roman society was highly structured. It was a very, very hierarchically oriented society. There were the nobility, and there was everybody else, slaves and commoners. And so it was very class-oriented, very structured. So if you accuse somebody of being ignorant and poor, that was a very big put-down to a Roman noble. And Roman nobility would not want to associate with anything that had to do with the poor at all. And so they said that, the only people who belong to the faith are these socially inferior classes, manual workers, children, women, slaves, all these people you don't want to associate with. So they attacked the faith by saying these are groups of people that no respectable Roman would want to join. Another attack that they levied against the church was against the Christians was that Christians were bad citizens because they refused to worship the state gods. They refused to worship the emperor. Christians met in secret. They were this own little organization unto themselves, so they didn't participate in the life of the empire. This is what the attack says. That they didn't believe in or want the empire to do well, to be successful, to succeed, to be in a period of wealth and of peace, that they were against the empire. Again, that's not true, but this is what they said. Now, the third attack that they levied against the church was that the church and Christians believed in unreasonable doctrine. The doctrine that Christians believed in was just so far-fetched, so unreasonable, that again, no self-respecting Roman would want to have anything to do with this group called Christians. They particularly focused on the incarnation. Remember that we said that central doctrine of the faith. They attacked that and said it was completely unreasonable. And here's one attack. They wrote, this Roman writer wrote, the assertion that some God or Son of God has come down to earth as judge of mankind is most shameful, and no lengthy argument is required to refute it. What is the purpose of such a dissent on the part of God? Was it in order to learn what was going on among men? Does he not know everything? So you see how they're attacking in jest our faith. Why would God become man? If he's God, he knows everything. There's no reason for him to become man. It was their line of argument. One Roman writer in particular, a man by the name of Porphyry, was a Roman philosopher, wrote a book called Against the Christians. And in there he talks about this notion of unreasonable doctrine. He says, even supposing that some Greeks were stupid enough to think that gods dwell in statues, this would be a purer conception than to accept the fact that the divine had descended into the womb of the Virgin Mary, that he had become an embryo, that after his birth he had been wrapped in swaddling clothes, stained with blood, bile, and worse. Why, when he was taken before the high priest and governor, did not Christ say something worthy of a divine man? He allowed himself to be struck, spat upon on the face, crowned with thorns. Even if he had to suffer by order of God, he should have accepted the punishment, but should not have endured his passion without some bold speech, some vigorous and wise word, addressed to Pilate, his judge, instead of allowing himself to be insulted like one of the rabble off the streets. So Porphyry is a main problem with Christ in the incarnation is that obviously Christ couldn't have been God because he didn't make any bold speech in defense of himself. Right? Instead, he just suffered silently. And that's obviously not the signs of a great man or even of a divine man in the idea of Porphyry. Some of these attacks also against unreasonable doctrine, the Romans would write that the resurrection was just a lie, which we still unfortunately hear that line of thought in our modern world, that the resurrection never happens, it's a lie, the Christians made it all up. And obviously the scriptures were nothing more than just kind of crude fairy tales told again to the ignorant and poor. Now the fourth main attack that pagans levied against the church and against Christians were that Christians were cannibals. Now Roman society practiced many different immoral things. Well, one thing that Romans could not deal with at all was cannibalism. If you were a cannibal in the eyes of a Roman, that was the worst possible thing that you could do. So they accused the Christians of being cannibals, not only because we ate and drank the flesh and blood of our Lord, but also they believed actually that the Christians, when they met in secret, that what they did when they met in secret was they brought a young child or an infant into their midst, and that they would sacrifice the child and then kill it and then eat its flesh. This is what they believed that we were doing. Again, this is the propaganda that's going on. And this is what one pagan writer wrote. The story about the initiation of new recruits is as detestable as it is well known. An infant covered with flour in order to deceive the unwary is placed before the one who is to be initiated into the mysteries. Deceived by this floury mass, which makes him believe that his blows are harmless, the neophyte kills the infant. They avidly lick up the blood of the infant and argue over how to share its limbs. By this victim they are pledged together, and it is because of their complicity in this crime that they keep mutual silence. So it's kind of an effective attack. If you don't want people to join the Christians, you find the one thing that Romans really can't stand, which is cannibalism, and you say, oh, this is what they do when they meet in secret. And so we'll see a little bit later that the Christians will develop. There are Christians who will come to the forefront, who will be apologists, who will defend the faith, who will answer these charges. And we'll talk about those people in our next session. Now, even though there was this propaganda against the Christians, there was still this attraction to the Christians. There were still people who converted to the faith, and the church began to grow. Now, one of the reasons, or some of the reasons why people were attracted to the faith was because really of the holiness of the people who lived the faith. As one kind of minor theme we'll see throughout church history is this fact that holiness attracts. Whenever you have someone living a holy life in imitation of the Lord, that attracts others to live that life as well. So holiness attracts. And this was definitely true during this period of church history. So the martyrs gave an effective witness of their faith. And the people asked questions. Why would these Christians suffer such horrible, such horrible pain, such horrible deaths? Why would they do this? What would motivate them to continue to hold on to this faith when all they had to do was sacrifice to the gods, when all they had to do was worship the emperor? Why would they do that? That was a question placed in the minds of Romans, and they began to see these Christians and see the love that they had for Christ and the church, and that began to, over time, change some minds, and people were attracted to the faith. Also, the Christians practiced and lived fully the theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. And in particular, in terms of love, people could see how the Christians loved each other, how they mutually supported one another, how they loved each other as part of a family, as brothers and sisters. And it wasn't just only the love that Christians showed for each other, but also at certain times we have accounts of Christians showing love to the pagans, to the pagan Romans. During outbreaks of plague, for example, the Christians wouldn't just close in on themselves and only help each other. They would actually go out of the community and help pagans who were suffering from the disease as well. And so again, all of these actions that the Christians undertook brought the spotlight onto them and helped Romans see through some of this propaganda and then be attracted to the church and actually become members of the church. So even though we had this attraction in some cases of people joining the church, we still see this period of persecution. We still have many persecutions that erupt over these next several centuries. Why is that? Why is the big question that we ask out of this time period? Why would the Romans even care to persecute this seemingly insignificant sect, this insignificant amount of people.